Hello, my name is Gabriela Constantin-Dureci, and I am a PhD student in the Second Language Acquisition and Bilingualism program at Rutgers University in New Brunswick. I am here with you today to present my case study, Challenging Dominant Language Ideology in the Adult ESL Classroom. You have my email address at the bottom in case you wish to contact me with any questions about the presentation. I hope you enjoy it. Here we have an outline for today's presentation. So we'll start with the introduction. We'll briefly go over the literature review for this case study, and then we will look at the data, the method, and the analysis of this study. Finally, the discussion and conclusion and references. The premise for this project was that while the hegemonic discourse, so the discourse or discourses of power we encounter in our society, often enter the classroom, the students and the teacher have the potential to challenge the status quo instead of reproducing it. And moreover, under this framework, we consider language as a social identification tool. Moreover, language is ideologically saturated, so that we know that certain language practices will be praised and considered superior, while others in turn will be degraded and considered deficient, considered inferior. Let's briefly talk about language ideology. Language ideology consists of beliefs about language and language use, and it links linguistic practices to a predetermined social order, therefore granting privileges to some but not to others. In other words, the type of language that we use and the language practices that we engage in are deeply associated with what is perceived to be our role in society, our social status. Moreover, in the United States, the language ideology that is predominant is a standard language ideology, which is imposed and maintained by dominant institutions. So these dominant institutions, these systems, have a very important role in supporting and making language ideologies more prevalent in our society. And standardized English is considered the only appropriate form of a language. In their review of several studies, Farr and Song say that language ideology has a direct impact in informing educational policy. And they identified the most prevalent language ideologies in American education as the belief in language standardization and the belief in monolingualism, which Silverstein coined as the culture of monoglotte standard. The experiences that occur within educational settings are of particular interest to the present study, since they reflect how dominant language ideology operates within institutions of power. While language ideology is by no means a recent invention, it is still prevalent in modern society, discouraging the use of vernacular dialects, code mixing, code switching, as well as the English-only movement, speak to the extent to which, to this day, social hierarchies are kept in place through the symbolic conferral of prestige upon certain language practices and the discrediting of others. And as a result, the institutions that promote language standardization as a way for individuals to gain access to codes of power fail to recognize their complicity in supporting or disadvantaging students based on the language practices that they employ. Now moving on to the actual study. So the research question that I had in mind when I began conducting the study was, how do teachers' practices reinforce or challenge dominant language ideology? Now let's discuss the data. So this was a ethnographic case study, and I observed one adult ESL teacher, the pseudonym of Genevieve. I collected data over 3 lessons in 2 different classes. And overall, the study contained multiple sources and modes of data. So there was a questionnaire, and there were in-person observations. There was a semi-structured interview with Genevieve, and the teaching artifacts that Genevieve so kindly provided, such as the textbooks and other teaching materials that she prepared herself. In terms of the method, as I said, this was an ethnographic study. So after collecting the data, I transcribed the interview and the instances of talk during the observations. And after this, I coded the data, so the interview and the field notes, for instances of talk about multilingualism, language variation, and standardized English, which were the three features that I was looking at in terms of dominant language ideology. Then I categorized these instances as either reinforcing dominant language ideology or challenging it. And my methodology was informed by critical discourse analysis. And now let's move on to the analysis. First, we are going to look at how Genevieve challenged dominant language ideology. So I must tell you that Genevieve expressed her admiration for her multilingual students from the beginning. She called them brave on multiple occasions, underlining the complexity of their life experiences. She displayed openness towards multilingualism by allowing students to code switch and expressing very positive attitudes towards language variation. Now I want us to look at some excerpts from the data. Start with excerpt 1, what you say in Spanish. And this very short excerpt, Genevieve affiliates with students' language practices. So she code switches herself publicly in front of the class, thus aligning with students' language practices. We see in line 2 how she code switches from English into Spanish by offering the Spanish name, gripe, for the virus that she might have, the flu. And also in the same line, she prospectively draws attention to her code switching by prefacing the word gripe with the announcement, what do you say in Spanish? In excerpt number 2, Genevieve approaches a group of Spanish-speaking students and asks them in English, as you can see in line 2, if they're almost finished. Then in line 3, a student contributes a reply to Genevieve's question in Spanish, casi casi, almost, almost. In line 4, Genevieve ends this exchange by repeating the student's answer in its form in Spanish. This is a very interesting exchange because it's an IRF exchange, an initiation reply feedback exchange. And while it is very common that teachers repeat a student's response to show agreement or acknowledgement, Genevieve also maintains the student's choice of language because, as you see in line 4, she replies in Spanish. Moreover, let's remember the context in which this exchange takes place, an ESL classroom. So Genevieve could have opted for repeating the answer that the student gave in line 3, but translating it into English. However, Genevieve repeats it in the language that the student provided for communication. So by doing this, Genevieve shows affiliation with students' language practices. Excerpt from the interview I had with Genevieve. So in lines 1 and 2, I ask her if it's appropriate to code switch or use multiple languages in the class. And lines 3, 4, Genevieve self-identifies as the teacher who allows it, even encourages it. She takes a favorable viewpoint, which we can see reflected in the juxtaposition of allow in line 3 and encourage. in line 4. However, the hedge, I wouldn't say, in line 4, downplays the strength of her perspective. The presence of the preposition epistemic hedge, I don't know what's best, in line 5, further signals Genevieve's caution in formulating a clear stance. So what we see here is a bit of an ambiguous position that Genevieve is taking in formulating her answer to my question. However, we also see how the turn ultimately pivots from this position of ambiguity, signaled by I don't know what's best, to one of approval. I think it's okay to code switch. And ultimately, in the final line, in line 6, she reinforces her belief and indicates approval towards the practice of code switching through the final, it's fine. So although we see these hedging expressions that mark ambiguity and potential lack of agreement with either stance, ultimately, Genevieve does convey agreement to my question and says that it is fine to code switch and use multiple languages in the class. Again, from the interview, we have excerpt 4, in which I asked her if she only teaches her students the standard language, so standardized English. Genevieve was very quick to articulate her response in line 3 and simply said no. Then she further elaborated. So in lines 4 and 5, we can see her indirect definition for language variation. So language practices that vary across different contexts. And she also offers a premise for incorporating language variation in the ESL classroom. Since we know there are many registers, dialects, or regional varieties that students might encounter in their interactions outside a university classroom, it is essential that students become familiarized with different language practices and resources. So in this regard, the ESL classroom should not be expected to include homogeneous language practices, but rather a variety of resources that mirror the rich and vibrant linguistic configuration of the outside world. This view is further reinforced in lines 7 and 8, in which Genevieve states her philosophy as an ESL teacher. I help them to learn whatever they want to know, whatever will help them in their daily lives. Specifically, in line 8, she recognizes that teaching language variation in the classroom better equips her students to succeed in their interactions. So whatever will help them in their daily lives. As a result, Genevieve shows an accepting stance towards language variation and seems to have a teaching approach that does not prioritize one language practice or dialect over another, but allows for variety and thinks of this variety as being beneficial to students' learning, to students' authentic learning of the language. Ultimately, in doing so, she counteracts dominant language ideology that establishes standardized English as the only norm. Now we will move to the second part of the analysis, in which we look at the instances in which dominant language ideology was reinforced. Fortunately, I have to admit that I only found one instance of dominant language ideology being reinforced, and it was when Genevieve inadvertently brought up the native-non-native dichotomy, which places the native speaker as the standard for language knowledge, so as the superior, as the ideal language speaker. This exchange takes place after Genevieve has given the students their midterms back, and the majority of them were struggling with vocabulary. So Genevieve discusses the advantages of having a rich vocabulary. but in doing so, she inadvertently reinforces the native-non-native dichotomy. So in line 1, Genevieve draws attention to this construct of the native speaker. And this perspective can serve to fuel the native-non-native dichotomy, which idealizes the native speaker and contrasted with the non-native speaker who has diminished abilities. This constant comparison between the two, between the native and the non-native speaker, is further supported through the comparative better than in line 5, which suggests that the standard for knowledge is the native speaker, and non-native speakers should compare themselves to the standard that the native speaker symbolizes. And the intention here does seem that Genevieve is trying to motivate her students and trying to encourage them to improve their vocabulary. However, in doing so, she does position the native speaker as the reference point that her students, her non-native speaker students, should aspire to reach. And unfortunately, as a result, she reconstructs the native-non-native dichotomy in her ESL classroom. And thus, she adheres to dominant language ideology. She reinforces the tenets of dominant language ideology. Finally, the discussion and conclusion. So we've seen how Genevieve resisted the ideology of monolingualism. She allowed her students to code switch, and she engaged in code switching herself. So she affiliated with students' practices. She seemed to view their multilingualism as a resource rather than a deficit. Moreover, she had a favorable stance towards incorporating language variation in the classroom. And these two are very good arguments for challenging dominant language ideology. However, her position seemed to be ambiguous at times. She assumed a native speaker as the authority for linguistic expertise, which actually reinforces dominant language ideology. Lastly, let's mention a main limitation of this study, among many others that I'm sure are. So one of the main limitations is that it is possible that during the interview, Genevieve actually reported practices that she does not produce in her actual teaching. Remember, the research question was, how do teachers' practices challenge or reinforce dominant language ideology? So it is very possible that during the interview, Genevieve conveyed her beliefs in what should be done rather than what she's actually doing. So I believe that future research should adopt a longitudinal orientation that would show us the connection between beliefs and practices. These are my references. And I would like to thank you for your attention. If you have any questions, you have my email there, and please do not hesitate to reach out. Thank you so much.